In the heart of the open ocean, a cruise ship is supposed to be an escape, an oasis of leisure, luxury, and freedom. Yet the history of ocean travel has always balanced wonder with danger. Long before modern cruise liners became floating resorts, maritime exploration was shaped by centuries of trial, error, and tragedy. Engineers and shipbuilders pushed boundaries with steel hulls, wireless radios, radar, and satellite navigation, each innovation promising safer voyages, while governments and commercial companies raced to outdo one another in size, elegance, and speed. But even as technology advanced, the pressures to maintain schedules, cut costs, and satisfy the booming tourism industry often pushed ships and crews to their limits. Behind every gleaming vessel was a complex system of human judgment, mechanical dependence, and environmental unpredictability. As the decades progressed and the cruise industry exploded into a global phenomenon, millions came to trust these ships as sanctuaries, places where time slowed, where the sea became a backdrop rather than a force to respect. But history has shown that in moments of crisis, luxury evaporates in seconds. When disasters struck, they unfolded not as distant headlines, but as terrifying, minute-by-minute battles for survival. Passengers, who had boarded with excitement, instead found themselves navigating darkened corridors, rising water, panicked crowds, and the deafening confusion of alarms and orders. Crew members, trained for emergencies they hoped would never come, faced the impossible task of saving lives while confronting their own fear. And when the unthinkable happened, when ships capsized, collided, or burned, the aftermath rippled far beyond the ocean. Families waited for news that never came. Nations demanded inquiries. Maritime laws were rewritten. Memorials rose to honor those lost. The tragedies recorded in maritime history are not merely stories of ships, but stories of people, of their courage, their terror, their final moments, and the lessons that reshaped the seas forever. We begin with the most iconic maritime disaster in modern history, the RMS Titanic. When she set sail in April 1912, she represented far more than a ship. She was a bold statement about human ingenuity and the technological ambition of the early 20th century. Nations and shipping companies were locked in intense competition, each striving to outbuild the other with vessels that were faster, larger, and more luxurious. The Titanic was the crowning achievement of this rivalry, a floating palace equipped with cutting-edge engineering, watertight compartments, electric elevators, Marconi wireless systems, and engines powerful enough to propel the massive liner across the Atlantic with unprecedented speed. Newspapers hailed her as unsinkable, and her owners, under pressure to dominate transatlantic travel, embraced that reputation with pride. Yet, the very confidence that surrounded her construction and launch also created an atmosphere where risk was underestimated and warnings were too easily dismissed. On the night of April 14, 1912, the North Atlantic was unusually calm, a deceptive, glassy stillness with no moonlight to reveal lurking ice. The lookout crew, working without binoculars, scanned the darkness for glimmers of danger. At 11:40 p.m., a faint black shape emerged too late to avoid, an iceberg, towering and silent. The officers ordered the engines reversed and the ship veered hard to port. Passengers felt only a gentle vibration, nothing that suggested disaster. But deep below, where few ever ventured, steel plates buckled inward as the iceberg scraped along the starboard side. Water flooded into 5 compartments, one more than the Titanic could survive, according to her own design limitations. The next several hours unfolded with a mixture of confusion, disbelief, and rising dread. Officers hesitated to alarm the passengers, and many guests, dressed in their finest evening wear, stepped onto the decks expecting a minor inconvenience. Ice glittered like shattered glass across the bow, yet the ship still felt solid under their feet. As the bow dipped lower, crew members began uncovering the lifeboats. There were only 20, far fewer than needed for the 200 souls aboard. Regulations of the era, outdated and complacent, had never been revised to account for ships of Titanic's immense size. Even worse, many boats were launched partially empty, a result of miscommunication, disbelief, and the fear that overloading them might cause them to snap. As the clock neared 1:30 a.m., the severity of the situation became undeniable. The slant of the deck grew steeper, the lights flickered, and the icy water crept across the lower corridors. Families were torn apart as women and children were urged into boats, while men were ordered to stand back. Some officers enforced the rules with trembling resolve. Others faced violent resistance from panicked passengers. The band continued to play, an act of calm defiance that would be remembered as one of the night's most haunting images. In the final moments, with the stern rising high above the ocean, screams and prayers filled the freezing air. At 20:20 a.m., Titanic broke in two and sank beneath the waves, taking more than 500 people into the black waters. The aftermath reshaped the world's understanding of maritime safety. Nations demanded accountability. Inquiries exposed systemic failures, inadequate lifeboat laws, communication lapses, and blind trust in technological supremacy. The tragedy led to the creation of the International Ice Patrol, mandatory 24-hour radio watch, and rigorous new lifeboat requirements. Memorials arose on both sides of the Atlantic, silent reminders of the night when human pride collided with the raw, unforgiving power of nature. And though the sea was calm when the Titanic went down, its legacy would stir the conscience of generations to come. September 28, 1994. The MS Estonia leaves the port of Tallinn under a low, heavy sky, beginning what should have been an uneventful overnight cruise to Stockholm. For decades, ferries had been the lifeline of the Baltic region, part of a well-oiled transportation network connecting Scandinavia and the newly independent Baltic states after the collapse of the Soviet Union. These vessels were symbols of growing economic freedom and cultural exchange, and their operators faced constant pressure to run tight schedules despite unpredictable seas. The Estonia herself was a modern roll-on, roll-off ferry, designed to carry cars, cargo, and nearly 1,000 passengers. Yet beneath her sleek profile lay a known vulnerability shared by many ferries of her type: the bow-visor, a massive hinged gate at the front of the ship. Engineers had long debated the safety of such designs, especially in rough northern waters, but economic demands and competitive pressures outweighed the concerns. Passengers boarding that evening felt nothing but anticipation. Business travelers, families, young people returning home, each trusting the ship's reputation and the routine nature of the voyage. By midnight, the Baltic Sea had begun to churn with violent winds that tore across the deck at hurricane-level force. Inside, most passengers were already asleep in their cabins, unaware that the waves were striking the bow with increasing intensity. On the bridge, the crew monitored the situation closely, but weather this harsh was not unfamiliar in the region. It was shortly after 1 a.m. when the first ominous sounds echoed through the ship, deep metallic bangs that reverberated along the hull. Crew members checked the bow visor, suspecting the pounding was caused by the sea slamming against the ship's forward structure. But within minutes, the visor's locking mechanisms failed. A catastrophic chain reaction followed. The entire bow visor tore loose, exposing the inner ramp. Water surged onto the car deck in massive volumes, and because the deck spanned the width of the ship, the accumulated water acted like a destabilizing weight, swinging from side to side with each swell. The Estonia began to list sharply to starboard. Passengers were jolted awake as their cabins shifted beneath them, some thrown from their beds as the floor became a steep incline. Alarms wailed through the corridors, but confusion dominated, voices shouting in multiple languages, doors stuck due to the tilt, and hallways transforming into nearly vertical shafts. Survivors later described scenes of chaos as furniture hurled itself across rooms, crushing some and injuring others. People scrambled through darkened passageways, their hands slipping on wet floors as cold seawater gushed in. The ship lost power, plunging the interior into blackness. Panic spread as passengers fought to reach the upper decks, many without life jackets because storage lockers were already submerged or inaccessible. Within minutes, the Estonia rolled onto her side. Lifeboats could not be properly launched, and inflatable rafts were torn away by the storm. Hundreds were cast directly into the freezing Baltic. Waters so frigid that hypothermia began shutting down the body within minutes. Those who survived the initial plunge described the horror of clinging to debris, hearing cries fade into the darkness as exhaustion and cold overtook their fellow passengers. Only 137 people survived of the 989 aboard, rescued by nearby vessels that fought through the storm to reach the disaster site. In the aftermath, the scale of the tragedy shocked Europe. Families across Estonia, Sweden, and Finland waited for news that often never came, as many victims' bodies were never recovered. Investigations revealed critical design flaws, inadequate visor locking mechanisms, and emergency procedures that failed under real-world conditions. The disaster spurred sweeping changes in ferry construction, including strengthened bow structures, mandatory monitoring systems, and stricter evacuation standards. Memorials were erected across the region. Solemn tributes to those lost and reminders of the night when the Estonia vanished into the storm, leaving behind a sorrow that reshaped maritime safety for generations. December 20th, 1987. The Philippines was alive with the energy of the Christmas season, a time when families traveled across islands to reunite with loved ones. Island ferries like the MV Doña Paz were essential to the nation's transportation network, lifelines connecting communities, separated by vast stretches of water. But this demand placed enormous pressure on ferry operators, who routinely faced overcrowding, outdated safety standards, and minimal oversight. The Doña Paz, once a proud vessel in the domestic fleet, had long been operating under conditions that reflected the economic and political struggles of the era. Regulations existed on paper, but enforcement was inconsistent. Passenger limits were regularly ignored, and maintenance standards were strained by tight budgets and tight schedules. Still, thousands put their trust in these ferries, believing that the voyage, one many had taken countless times, would unfold as it always had. Shortly before 10 p.m., as the Doña Paz traveled through the Tablas Strait, most passengers had settled in for the night. Families slept on mats laid across hallways, children dozed in their parents' arms, and others passed the time chatting on open decks, enjoying the humid December breeze. Many had no assigned cabins. The ferry was carrying far more than its official capacity of about 1,500. Later investigations estimated over 4,000 people were on board, many unlisted, traveling without official tickets, a common practice at the time. The ship moved steadily through the darkness, its crew navigating the familiar waters with no warning of what was about to unfold. At approximately 10:30 p.m., the Doña Paz collided with the MT Vector, an oil tanker carrying over 1 million liters of petroleum products. The tanker's cargo had been improperly maintained, and the vessel itself sailed with a skeletal crew and questionable seaworthiness. The collision ruptured the Vector's cargo tanks, releasing gasoline and kerosene across the surface of the water. In seconds, the sea ignited. Witnesses later described hearing a thunderous explosion, followed by a wall of fire racing across the waves. Flames engulfed the Doña Paz with brutal speed, sweeping across the decks and pouring into the ship's interior. Passengers awoke to thick smoke, blinding heat, and screams from every direction. Many had no time to reach life jackets. Some because the lockers were locked, others because the flames reached them first. Survivors recalled how the fire illuminated the night sky with an eerie brightness, as if dawn had arrived in an instant. Those who leapt into the water found no refuge. The surface itself burned, a sheet of fire stretching in every direction. People dove beneath the flames, resurfaced gasping for air, then dove again, desperate to escape the inferno. Parents clung to children, strangers held onto one another, but the toxic fumes and scorching heat overwhelmed most within minutes. Only a handful survived, rescued by passing vessels hours later, dazed, trembling, and covered in burns. The scale of loss was so vast that entire families disappeared without a trace, leaving behind no bodies to mourn. In the aftermath, the world struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the disaster. More than 300 lives were lost, making it the deadliest peacetime maritime accident in modern history. Investigations exposed systemic failures, lax maritime oversight, inadequate training, poor maintenance, and the dangerous acceptance of overcrowding. The tragedy forced the Philippines to reevaluate its maritime regulations, leading to reforms in vessel inspection, emergency equipment standards, and crew certification. Memorials were erected in remembrance of those who perished, but for many families, the absence of remains meant their grief unfolded without closure. The Doña Paz became a symbol of how human negligence, economic pressures, and regulatory failure can converge in a single night to create devastation on an unimaginable scale, a tragedy that still echoes across the Philippines decades later. January 13, 2012. In an era defined by satellite, guided precision, and digital navigation systems that promised near-flawless operation, the Costa Concordia represented the pinnacle of modern cruising, an enormous, floating city carrying more than 4,000 people. Cruise ships of this scale were the result of decades of technological ambition and relentless commercial competition. Companies advertised these vessels not simply as transportation, but as destinations, emphasizing entertainment, luxury, and spectacle. Yet the pressure to innovate, impress, and maintain tight schedules created an environment where human decision-making remained as critical and as fallible as ever. Captains were celebrated personalities, encouraged to perform scenic, sail, bus, to delight passengers and gain publicity. The Concordia herself had performed such maneuvers before, and on this night, with calm seas and clear visibility, the ship's master believed the risk was minimal. As the Concordia neared the island of Giglio around 9:45 p.m., many passengers were sitting down to dinner, enjoying the soft glow of dining room lights and the gentle hum of engines beneath their feet. The night felt still, almost serene. But on the bridge, the ship had already drifted too close to the shoreline. Despite the sophisticated radar arrays and GPS systems at his disposal, the captain relied heavily on visual navigation, choosing a path that left only a narrow margin for error. That error came abruptly. At 9:45 p.m., a sudden shudder rippled through the hull as the ship struck the hidden lee Skull Reef. The collision tore a long gash in the port side, rupturing several compartments. Water surged in at an unstoppable rate, disabling generators and flooding lower decks within minutes. Yet, even as alarms sounded, the full gravity of the situation did not reach the passengers. The PA announcements were vague, instructing everyone to remain calm and stay in their cabins. Crew members, uncertain of the severity, tried to maintain order with reassurances that contradicted their own rising fear. Some passengers returned to their meals, others wandered the corridors trying to understand the source of the vibrations. But deep within the ship, engineers were already wading through water up to their knees, watching as entire sections lost power and machinery failed. The Concordia began to list, the tilt so gradual at first that many barely noticed, until the angle sharpened, sending glasses sliding off tables and passengers stumbling in confusion. By 10:20 p.m., the ship's fate was sealed. Darkness swept through the vessel as electrical systems failed. Cabins plunged into blackness, trapping some behind doors jammed by the tilt. Finally, at 10:32 p.m., nearly an hour after the collision, the order to abandon ship was issued. Panic erupted instantly. Lifeboats jammed in their davits because the tilt made lowering them nearly impossible. Families, separated in the confusion, screamed names into the chaos. Crew members fought to organize the evacuation, some displaying remarkable bravery as they guided passengers across slanted decks that were becoming slick with seawater. Others froze, overwhelmed by the catastrophe unfolding around them. Passengers slid down hallways turned nearly vertical, clutching railings and each other as they tried to reach any exit that wasn't already underwater. Outside, the night was filled with the roar of escaping steam, the crash of unsecured objects tumbling, and the desperate pleas of those who had nowhere left to go. Rescue boats from the island arrived quickly, but the sheer scale of the ship and its thousands of occupants transformed the evacuation into a race against time. The Concordia continued rolling onto her side, her massive frame groaning as it settled into the shallow waters near the shore. By the time the last survivors were pulled to safety, 32 people were gone, victims of drowning, entrapment, or injuries sustained in the chaos. In the aftermath, the world confronted a sobering truth. Even in the age of digital navigation and advanced engineering, human error remained one of the deadliest forces at sea. International maritime regulations were overhauled, including stricter evacuation procedures, enhanced crew training, and greater oversight of ship routes and bridge operations. Memorials were created to honor the victims, and the wreck of the Concordia was eventually removed after one of the most complex salvage operations in history. The tragedy served as a stark reminder that technology may guide a ship, but responsibility and risk ultimately lie in human hands. So why revisit these painful stories? Because every loss changed something. Long before these tragedies reshaped maritime law, the world of ocean travel existed in a delicate balance between innovation, economics, and public confidence. Just as nations have historically poured resources into space exploration to demonstrate technological might and political prestige, the maritime industry, too, has been driven by competitive pressures, not between planets, but across oceans. Cruise lines and ferry operators sought to build faster, larger, more luxurious vessels, each one marketed as safer and more advanced than the last. Yet behind the public image of progress stood difficult questions. How far could technology be trusted? How much risk was acceptable? And who, ultimately, paid the price when systems failed? Each disaster forced governments and companies to confront uncomfortable truths they had long avoided, and each became a turning point in the evolving science of keeping human beings alive at sea. The Titanic disaster revealed how blind faith in new engineering could mask fatal vulnerabilities. At the time, maritime nations competed fiercely to build the grandest ships, and the Titanic symbolized not just luxury, but national pride. But its sinking exposed the consequences of outdated lifeboat laws, insufficient training, and an industry unwilling to slow down or compromise prestige. After 1912, policies changed overnight. Lifeboat requirements were rewritten, radio operations made mandatory, and international cooperation on ice monitoring became the new norm. Every improvement was forged in the heat of grief, driven by survivors' testimonies and the outcry of families who demanded that such a catastrophe never repeat itself. Decades later, the Estonia disaster forced Europe to confront its own assumptions about modern ferry design. Technological optimism had encouraged the widespread use of bow-visored ships, celebrated for their efficiency in loading vehicles and passengers. Yet the tragedy revealed the inherent risks of this architecture, risks amplified by harsh Baltic weather and insufficient structural safeguards. Investigators exposed overlooked design flaws, prompting sweeping reforms in stability standards, watertight integrity, and real-time visor monitoring. Countries that had once trusted the engineering of their fleets realized that the pursuit of efficiency had overshadowed the basic principles of survivability. The loss of 852 lives became a catalyst for redesigning ships across an entire region. The Doña Paz tragedy struck at the heart of Southeast Asia's maritime culture, where ferries are lifelines for millions and economic pressures often override safety concerns. Overcrowding, lax enforcement, and aging vessels had long been tolerated as unavoidable realities. But after more than 300 lives were lost in one unimaginable night, the world looked closely at long-standing practices that had gone unquestioned. Policies tightened, inspections grew stricter, training improved, and international organizations placed new scrutiny on developing nations' maritime safety systems. Though change was gradual, the disaster left a permanent imprint on how ferry operations are regulated and monitored. Even in the technologically sophisticated age of the Costa Concordia, where radar, GPS, and advanced stabilizers were thought to eliminate the human element from disaster. The ship's capsize proved that the most dangerous variable remained human judgment. Training requirements were revised globally, bridge procedures standardized, and evacuation protocols strengthened to ensure that no crew would ever again face an emergency so unprepared. But beyond policies and protocols, these tragedies remind us that every statistic represents a life, a family, and a future that never arrived. Every reform is written in the memory of those who were lost. And every journey at sea is safer today because their stories were told, and because the world listened. In telling these stories, we honor those who were lost and acknowledge the choices and failures that led to their fate. Throughout history, whenever human beings have reached for progress, whether in the depths of the ocean or the frontier of space, the pursuit of innovation has always carried both promise and danger. The maritime world, much like the early space program, evolved through a mixture of ambition, pride, and political pressures. Nations and companies wanted to prove their dominance on the seas, just as they once raced to the stars, and in that pursuit, they often placed immense faith in technology. Ships grew larger, faster, and more complex, becoming symbols of engineering triumph. But progress has a shadow. Every advancement brings its own blind spots, and every system, no matter how sophisticated, relies on human judgment. These tragedies remind us that even the most advanced vessels are only as safe as the choices made by those who build, maintain, and command them. When disaster strikes at sea, it unfolds with a brutal clarity that echoes the great failures of human exploration. The moment of impact, the sudden shift from routine to catastrophe, resembles the split-second failures that have shaped the legacy of spaceflight disasters. People faced with the unimaginable must act without hesitation, and their courage emerges in the smallest gestures: a parent shielding a child from debris, a stranger helping another reach a lifeboat, a crew member staying behind to guide passengers through smoke-filled corridors. These are moments in which fear and bravery intermingle, where survival depends not only on technology, but on instinct and compassion. As the ocean surges in, as decks tilt and lights fail, human lives pivot on decisions made in seconds. Decisions shaped by training, communication, and sometimes sheer determination. For the families who lost loved ones, the sea became an unresolved chapter, one that could never be rewritten. Many never recovered remains. Others received only fragments of information, incomplete explanations, or contradictions that fueled their anguish. In the aftermath, grief turned into forceful demand. Demand for accountability, for reform, for proof that their loved ones had not died in vain. Investigations unfolded with the gravity of national inquiries, exposing weaknesses in oversight, emergency planning, ship design, and corporate culture. Just as failures in early rocket launches or shuttle missions reshaped aerospace protocols, these maritime tragedies reshaped the very foundation of ocean travel. International conventions were amended, evacuation procedures standardized, and safety drills made mandatory. Engineers reconsidered structural designs that had once been industry norms, and governments strengthened their maritime agencies to prevent future lapses. Yet beyond all the technical reforms lies something deeper, a reminder of human fragility in the face of nature's power. Cruise ships may be marvels of engineering, but the ocean remains vast, unpredictable, and unforgiving. Its calm surface can conceal danger. Its beauty can mask its force. The tragedies we have explored remind us that safety, vigilance, and respect for the sea are never optional. They urge us to remember the individuals behind the statistics, to honor their stories, and to recognize the lessons purchased with their lives. Thank you for watching. If you'd like a part 2, deeper analysis, or breakdowns of specific ships, let me know. This is the creator, signing off.